Well, it's that time once again. Time for me to review a ton of horror movies all at once. Indeed, as I said, it's time for me to review all of the movies I've received from HorrorPack over the last 6 months. For those of you who may not know, HorrorPack is a horror movie subscription service. Every month they send me 4 DVDs and 4 Blu-rays, including one exclusive Blu-ray, and every month I open up those boxes here on this channel and discuss the great things I got. Overall, I've always been really impressed. But of course, because the movies are often new to me when I make those videos, I like to return later after I've seen all the movies to make a proper review. That is what this video is. Every 6 months, I review all 6 months worth all at once, discussing each movie briefly and rating them according to a simple system I've been using. This video will contain reviews for every HorrorPack movie from September of 2022 through February of 2023. Of course, it's now April of 2023, so this was a little bit delayed, but that's just because I've been stupid, crazy busy, and it took me a little while to finish watching all of the movies and assemble my reviews and get to making this video. But now I've done it, so better late than never. And the ratings criteria are simple. I divide the films into 3 categories. Here on my left, I put the films that didn't really work for me. They may not be the worst ever. In fact, I made a whole video on the worst horror movies ever, and very few from HorrorPack have ever come even close to being that terrible. But for whatever reason, they just aren't my cup of tea. They correspond to 1 or 2 star ratings if I were assigning ratings on a 5-star rating system. Here in the middle, I put a middle category, which is inevitably where most of the movies will end up. These correspond to 3 or 4 star reviews. I often tell people that I'm not all that hard to please, so it doesn't take all that much to rise above the lower category and make it into the good category. They can be serious or silly, objectively good, or just fun to watch, but if they keep me entertained for a couple hours, they belong here in the middle. Finally, though I'm not hard to please, I am extraordinarily hard to really blow away. But every once in a while, it happens. When it does, I place those films here on my right, in a top category corresponding to high 4 to 5 star ratings. In other words, I sort all of the films into categories of great, good, and not so good. Because having only 3 categories is a fairly low-resolution rating system, of course I'll also be sharing some of my thoughts, however briefly, regarding the reasons for my ratings, so you can figure out which ones might be for you or might not be for you. If you do find one that is for you and you want to get a copy for yourself, I'll have purchase links down in the What's It so you can find at least most of the movies for yourself. That way you can get some great movies and do so in a way that helps support my work here on this channel. It's good for you, it's good for me, and it's good for the filmmakers. It's a win-win-win all the way around. But I think that's enough of me prattling on. Let's get right to the reviews. And buckle up because we've got a lot of movies to talk about. First up, because September marked the first month in my new subscription, or my renewal, I got my 2 renewal bonus movies that they send whenever we renew an annual subscription. One for the DVD subscription and one for the Blu-ray one. So let's start with those. First up is the Heroes of Horror collection. This was actually a really nice collection. It's a pack of a whole bunch of films, which I always like because even though there are usually a few lesser offerings in these collections, there are also always a few gems, and it's a great way to bulk up one's collection all in one place. This one is all the better because it features films starring such giants as Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff, 2 of the true, as the title of the collection would suggest, heroes of horror, and basically patron saints of this channel. If you're looking for classic horror, including a few titles you might have missed over the years, this is a great one for you to check out, and I really can't recommend this one highly enough. We're starting the year off great this time with an entry right out of the gate into the elusive top category. Next is Eli Roth's History of Horror, Season 1. When one sits down to watch a history of horror that's some 5 hours long, as this is, one has certain expectations. First of all, one expects to be thoroughly entertained by the discussion. Secondly, one expects to learn something new about the genre and its history. On the first point, this documentary excels. It's certainly a pleasure to watch, and the various people Eli Roth interviews for the program invariably give excellent comments as we follow the history of the genre through several subgenres. And I actually think the way the documentary was arranged is also a plus, because rather than tracing the history of the genre chronologically, each episode follows the development of particular subgenres, so it's always clear what significance each film discussed might hold. However, on my second point, I expected a little bit more. To be sure, I know horror movies and horror history better than most people, so I may not be a representative audience, but I found that while I enjoyed the documentary's discussions, I never really learned anything I didn't already know. It's fun to watch, but it traces a very familiar history of horror without really treading any new ground, or even mentioning new films of which I'd previously been unfamiliar. By all means, watch this program for an entertaining celebration of our favorite genre. It's worth a watch, and if you don't know your horror history the way I do, you very well might learn something, but the dyed-in-the-wool genre devotees will find little here to deepen their understanding. We're going to go ahead and make this the first one into the middle grouping. With those out of the way, let's jump right into the ones I got in September of 2022. I'll do my best, by the way, to present these in the same order in which I got them, so we're going month by month and starting with the DVDs first, then the Blu-rays, and then concluding with the HorrorPack exclusive Blu-rays at the very end for each month. So first up, we have a film called Revenge. As the title suggests, it's a revenge movie, and it's actually a member of a sort of subgenre that's gotten quite popular lately. A group of men do some horrible things to a woman, and she seeks some rather brutal revenge. If you think it sounds exactly like I Spit on Your Grave, you're not wrong. I'm not going to go as far as to say that it's a shot-for-shot remake of that movie. It isn't. And in fact, we already have a remake of the 1978 cult classic. On some level, I have to wonder why we needed another one of these movies. It doesn't really add anything new to the story. But, at the same time, the same argument can be made about a lot of horror movies, and we still keep watching them. So, despite the film being a bit formulaic, the question becomes whether it's a good movie, whether it's an entertaining watch. And overall, yeah, it's a good watch. It's absolutely been overhyped and is nowhere near being the cinematic revolution some critics tried to give it credit for, but it's worth a couple hours of your time. And so, as you might expect, it's one for the middle. Next up, we have a movie called Overlord. This one takes place during World War II and follows a group of Allied soldiers planning to breach a German tower. But while they're there, they uncover a German bioweapons experiment that delivers a few genuinely creepy moments. It sounds exactly like my kind of movie. And it's a lot of fun to watch, actually, even if it doesn't have quite as many scares as I'd like. Funny thing though, when I opened up the package containing this movie, I didn't remember having seen it. I didn't remember a thing about it. But when I watched it, I realized I actually had seen it and had completely forgotten about it. So take that as my review. It's a lot of fun to watch during the viewing, and I really don't have any complaints. But at the end of the day, it wasn't all that memorable. Almost by definition, that belongs to the middle, good but not great category. And that brings us to Ouijageist. It's a lot like what it sounds like. Somebody plays with a Ouija board and some evil spirit or spirits start to do their thing. We've seen that before, but as I've already mentioned, merely being a bit cliched, doesn't necessarily make something a bad movie. Neither does being low budget, which this one assuredly is. And I really wanted to like it because it's clear the people behind it were trying to do something great within their limited means, and I have to applaud anyone for actually getting a movie made. However, I think the problem here is that they tried to go a bit too far beyond their means and strained the film beyond its breaking point. It tries to do too much and ends up doing too little because it ends up feeling a bit disjointed. It's not quite scraping the bottom of the barrel, so I'm a bit reluctant to put it in the bottom category, but it honestly just doesn't quite stand up with the others, so with a heavy heart and reluctantly, I'm going to have to do so. Next, we have American Cannibal. With this movie, you pretty much get exactly what it says on the label. It's about 3 girls who steal a car. When it breaks down, they seek help at a nearby house, which turns out to be the home of a cannibal. And yeah, he promptly captures them, and the movie proceeds about as we'd expect. It's low budget for sure, and it shows in some moments in the film. The acting ranges from passable to good. The script is good but not great. It's basically exactly what you expect on every level, and that's a good thing and a bad thing. Nothing about this movie will challenge you on any level, and it may not be the most memorable in the world, but if you want to spend a little less than an hour and a half with the cannibal story, you're not going to be too disappointed. Once again, almost by definition, that's a middle group kind of a movie. That brings us to the Blu-rays, beginning with a film called Crabs. Okay, this movie is called Crabs, complete with the exclamation mark. I think we all know what kind of movie it's going to be. And if you're looking for that kind of movie, this will be a real winner for you. It's the kind of over-the-top, so bad it's good, cheesy monster movie we all know and love. This time featuring killer horseshoe crabs, those weird yet somehow innocent-looking little monsters of the deep. And it clearly knows exactly what it's trying to do. It even features a scene with the crabs taken right from the script of Gremlins. If you love a good monster movie, I think you're going to love this one. Best enjoyed as part of a cheesy movie night, so get yourself some cheesy snacks, cheese pizza, cheesecake, or whatever other cheesy snacks you like to serve on such an evening, and enjoy the insanity. Much to my own surprise, I'm putting this one in the top category. Next is Pet Sematary. I don't really think this one needs a whole lot of review or introduction from me. It's Pet Sematary, and this is a horror channel. If you found your way to my videos somehow without ever having read or seen Pet Sematary, I really don't know what to say. But where I think I can offer a bit of commentary is on this particular Blu-ray version. If you're looking for a copy of Pet Sematary, this is honestly a good way to go. These days, I think a lot of people are going to be looking primarily for the remake. However, the original from the late 1980s is by far a better film on most, not quite all, counts. Obviously, the production value of the remake is better, and John Lithgow as Judd turns in a truly excellent performance. However, both for adherence to Stephen King's source material and for providing a truly frightening experience, the original can't be beat. What I like here, though, is that by combining both versions, you're able to double the value of your purchase. And if you're just looking for the new one, you get the original included automatically, so you can see for yourself why I maintain that it's the superior cinematic offering. That said, though I didn't notice this when I first opened it, it is worth mentioning that only the original is on the Blu-ray, which is fine by me because that's the one I really want to watch. The remake is included in digital format. Personally, I don't like that. I don't see buying digital movies as actually buying them, because so much can go wrong. If they're streaming, you can lose access just on anyone's whim. If they're downloaded to your device, you're still going to have to deal with software issues. And most importantly, we lose something psychologically when we sacrifice physical media. When we lose sight of the physical and the tangible, we seem to lose track of the value of things, and our entire world seems to seem more disposable. Anyway, stepping off that particular soapbox for a while, I was quite happy to get this copy, and it belongs in the top category, primarily for the original, as the remake would likely find its way into the middle group. Next we have Paranormal Activity 2. The first Paranormal Activity movie was, in some ways, revolutionary. It wasn't the first movie about this kind of poltergeist activity that turns out to be dangerous and demonic. It wasn't the first found footage movie. But it was a great example of how effective simple scares can be with essentially no budget. In many ways, far more than being a pioneer of found footage movies, as it's often credited with being, I think it was actually a pioneer of the highly effective micro-budget horror. Almost a remedy to the excessive CGI and multi-million-dollar boondoggles by which Hollywood seems overrun. But this isn't a review of the first Paranormal Activity. It's a review of the first sequel, Paranormal Activity 2. And honestly, I'm still a fan. Obviously, since it is a sequel, it lacks the shock value and novelty of the first installment, so it would be essentially impossible for it to be as good. But it's still a good watch, and it does a good job of building on the mythology hinted at in the first film. Where I think it loses some of its strength was that it tried to do more than the first movie did. They lost sight of the fact that the unknown was the scariest part of the first movie, and tried to answer a few too many questions. I'm putting this one, therefore, into the middle group. And now we have The Winter Hunger. So this is the first HorrorPack exclusive of this, I guess, round of reviews. And it's a zombie movie. They say it's a rabies virus rather than a zombie virus, but the effect is identical. It's a zombie movie. But this isn't your World War Z kind of zombie action movie. No, this is a bleak and, I think, all too realistic look at a small group of people trying to survive the worst possible conditions. And that's what I like about it, because this isn't just a zombie story. This is a story of what happens when civilization collapses and people struggle not only against the monsters, but simply to keep their bellies full in the middle of a long and harsh winter. It was meant to be an exploration of the famine following the Spanish Civil War, and I think it stands out as a rather depressing and horrifying look at the dark side of the human experience and the fragility of civilization. This is one for the top group. Moving right along to October, generally thought to be the spookiest of all months. Fortunately, October was indeed a good month, not only in general, but also in terms of these offerings from HorrorPack, beginning with 10 Cloverfield Lane. Now, Cloverfield was a found footage kaiju movie, but this sequel feels entirely different. It's not found footage, and it takes place inside a shelter with nary a kaiju in sight. And yet, both films are excellent for entirely different reasons. This is the story of a woman who wakes up captive inside a shelter. She thinks she's been kidnapped. Her alleged captor, however, portrayed to perfection by the inimitable John Goodman, insists instead that he rescued her from the global disaster that forced the small company into the shelter, and that none of them can leave, not because he's keeping them captive, but because of whatever unnamed horrors are taking place outside. I love a movie like this, in which one alternates rapidly between perspectives. We're never sure who's correct, we don't know what's going on, and that uncertainty drives the horror in this movie and makes it one of the more intense and unsettling films of recent decades. I won't spoil anything except to say that we finally do get some answers by the end, but the real heart of the movie is everything that comes before. And it's driven entirely by the believability of the characters and the strength of the acting. This is another easy pick for the top category. Next we have Robert Reborn. Though the title suggests that this is about Robert the doll, the famous real-world haunted doll now housed at a museum in Florida, it's really connected with his story only in title. It actually follows conflict between Nazi and Soviet researchers, one of whom has a book that can animate the inanimate. And of course, he's used it on a collection of dolls. I really wanted to like this one a lot. I mean, look at these dolls on the cover. They just look like the kinds of things I would like. And in fact, I actually do quite like the dolls. The trouble is, the rest of the movie just doesn't quite live up to its promise. One thing is that it feels a lot more like a Puppet Master movie than A Tale About the Haunted Doll, so it didn't quite meet my expectations. But that could be okay. I like Puppet Master, so that's not necessarily a problem. The problem here is that its quality just isn't quite up to the standards, even of the various Puppet Master sequels. If it had chosen to lean all the way into horror comedy and just give us a bunch of whimsical kill scenes, I think it could have been a great B-movie. As it is, unfortunately, though I hesitate to call it terrible, it just didn't work for me. I'm reluctantly putting it into the lower group. Next we have The Intruders. Here's a movie about a girl who's come home from college and living with her father as she attempts to gain control of her mental illness. While there, she begins to think the house is being intruded by someone with malevolence in mind, but of course her father thinks it's all in her head. I love this kind of story. You know, with a title like The Intruders, you sort of expect something more like a home invasion tale, but this is actually a lot more of a character-driven work about one of my favorite issues. When someone believes one's senses, and when to doubt one's sanity. And I also had the strangest experience while watching it. I know I've never seen it before. I knew nothing of the plot, but several times throughout the film I had the weirdest sense of déjà vu because the movie as a whole was completely unknown to me until my recent viewing, but several individual scenes looked so familiar I'd have sworn I saw the movie before if I didn't know any better. So that's a weird experience that most other viewers probably won't have, but it probably did slightly color my own experience of the movie. Anyway, is it good or not? It is. It's actually a really good movie. Quite intriguing and tense throughout, though perhaps a bit predictable. And that's where it suffers a bit, and it might be where that sense of familiarity came from, because though there's really nothing wrong with this movie per se, it is remarkably reminiscent of any number of other films. So at the end of the day, I think you'll have a good time watching it, but it will likely blend with the rest of its subgenre in your memory. That makes it, as with so many others, perfect for the middle category. Next is Hostile. This isn't exactly a zombie movie, but if you think in terms of that zombie subgenre, you're likely on the right track. The creatures are actually more interesting than mere zombies, but it's still basically an apocalyptic tale. What sets it apart from most of that subgenre, though it's not the only film to use such a strategy, is that it's divided between the present day, in which our lead is stuck in a car with a broken leg and one of the creatures trying to get to her, and a series of flashbacks in which she recalls her life and relationship with her husband before the apocalypse. That alone is probably going to divide people, because I know a lot of people don't like too many flashbacks or non-linear forms of storytelling. Often I'm one of them. I tend to find experimental movies pretentious and often unwatchable. But in this case, it's not so much experimental as just giving us alternating timelines, and I can work with that. Once I know that that's what's happening, it doesn't bother me. And the result is a film that not only has some good action and creature effects, but a lot of heart. At least right up until the ending. I'm not going to spoil it, but let's just say I think the ending is going to divide audiences even more than the flashbacks. I'm still not sure whether I liked how it ended or not. But at the end of the day, it's another good movie, and it goes into that good category. Next we have It Stains the Sands Red. We've all seen a million zombie movies before. I, for one, usually like them, even if they're not terribly original, or frankly, even very good. But in this case, I'm pleased to report we got something a little different from anything we've seen before. I won't spoil all the details because some of its original elements do come relatively late in the story, but one thing I like is that this isn't the action horror movie about people fighting thousands and thousands of the Walking Dead. Rather, the bulk of the movie follows a single woman walking through the desert, pursued by a single relentless zombie. Arguably, that's not all that frightening. A single zombie ought to be easy to defeat. And in fact, the weak part of this movie is that all of the characters seem incredibly incompetent, sometimes but not always, even to the point of unlikability. However, it may be a worthwhile trade-off because there's something inherently frightening about being so relentlessly pursued, even if only by a single zombie. I think a lot of people will be pleasantly surprised by this one. Give it a watch. I'm putting it on the high end of the good category. Which brings us to Happy Birthday to Me. I think a lot of people might already know this one because it's kind of a minor cult classic. It follows a pretty standard slasher movie plot and doesn't really do anything new with it, except perhaps take all the favorite elements from its source material, movies like Friday the 13th and Prom Night, and amplify them almost but not quite to the point of parody. And that makes it, if not a very good movie, at least a lot of fun to watch. This is one for the fans of 80s horror. If you like that decade, and how could you not, this will be a good one for you if you haven't already seen it. It's not good enough for the great category, but it's, again, at the relatively high end of the good group. Next is Paranormal Activity 3. We already discussed Paranormal Activity 2, and now we come to the third one. Usually, by the third installment of a series, things are starting to go downhill. In this case, the opposite is true. No, this third movie is still nowhere near as good as the first one, but I actually think it's an improvement over the second. It still struggles a bit in that it's not as frightening as I wanted it to be, but it did do a good job of building on the story. This one is also going in the middle group along with the second one, though I do think it's better than the second one. It wasn't really until the fourth volume that this series really started to sort of go downhill and fall apart. But since HorrorPack didn't send Part 4, we don't need to worry about it. That brings us to another HorrorPack exclusive. This one is called Obsidian. This one is about a group of people gathered at a remote house to participate in a drug study. They all have a variety of disabilities or disfigurements, and the drug under study, called Obsidian, is supposed to be a sort of miracle regenerative cure for all their ailments. But as they're trapped together, they have to face both interpersonal conflict as well as a growing sense that something is really wrong with the pharmaceutical trial. It's a low-budget movie for sure, and it does have its flaws. Some elements of the plot really strain credulity. Why, for example, are people living together in this house as part of the clinical trial? That's not a normal practice, and it's never really explained why anyone would go along with it. Similar issues, including some that I won't mention because they involve spoilers, plague the entire film. However, if you can look past those, there's actually a lot to like about Obsidian. It's far from perfect, but it's a lot better than I expected at first, and I'm quite happy both to recommend it and to place it in my middle category. November, the month of Halloween hangovers and huge feasts. But just because Halloween was over, that doesn't mean I stopped watching horror. On the contrary, I ended up getting some great selections from HorrorPack in November of 2022 as well. We begin with Body Cam. This is a sort of combination between a found footage supernatural horror movie and a police procedural. It follows a cop as she tries to figure out what's happened to some of her fellow officers, using only some bizarre body cam footage to guide her discovery. At first, I expected it was going to be a found footage movie in the form of body cam footage. It's not. It's a traditional kind of movie. However, a lot of the action is seen in the form of the footage that our main character watches as she tries to investigate, so in a lot of ways, I think we're getting the best of both worlds. The narrative structure and production value of the traditional film with the creepy visuals of found footage. And indeed, One of the creepiest kinds of scenes, for me, occurs when police or other first responders show up at a crime scene and they don't know what's happened, but it's clear that something really bad went down. And this film uses scenes like that to full advantage. The ending, unfortunately, treads a little too far into the cliché, which is a shame since the movie up to that point was pretty original and really good, but even a slightly weak ending isn't quite enough to kill it. Once again, it's not going to be a new favorite by any means, but it's certainly worth watching and belongs to the middle category. Next we have The Hitchhiker. This is a collection of episodes from an old anthology program called, as you might suspect, The Hitchhiker. This is clearly a product of the 80s. It shows in every episode in the collection. But that's a good thing overall. Those of us who missed the horror stories of a few decades ago will find a lot to like here. If you already know The Hitchhiker, you pretty much know what you're going to get with this set. It's not the complete show, nor does it consist of the first 10 episodes. Rather, it's 10 episodes seemingly randomly selected from the show's run, but they do seem to provide a reasonably representative sample of what the program had to offer. If you don't know The Hitchhiker, all you really need to realize is that the hitchhiker of the title is a wandering character who introduces short horror films. The Crypt Keeper he ain't, and Tales from the Crypt the show ain't, but it's still good enough and creepy enough to keep horror fans entertained for several hours. It's another one for the good category. Next we have Dead Again. It's clear as soon as you start watching this movie, and maybe even as soon as you see the cover, this is essentially either a ripoff or homage, depending on whether you want to be cranky or generous, of films like Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz. And no, it does not quite live up to the films that so obviously inspired it. But if you look past the rough edges and occasionally flat comedic moments, there's actually something very much worth watching at the heart of it. It gives us all the things we expect from this kind of a zombie movie, and even manages to hint at something larger by the end, though some of its most original elements are never fully realized on screen. As long as you recognize it for what it is and don't expect too much from it, I think you'll be in for a fun, cheesy movie night. On a funny note, when I looked up the film on IMDb to do a bit of research and make sure I remembered all my facts correctly, I found that none other than Donald Trump himself is the very first star listed on the film. After a double take, I remembered he's featured in archival footage at the beginning of the movie. Something about seeing his name on IMDb just struck me as a bit funny. Regardless of that, it's another one for the middle group. Bringing us to A Quiet Place. I think most of us know this one by now. It's about monsters that are blind but attracted to sound, so the survivors of this sort of monster apocalypse have to stay perfectly silent. It's a pretty good movie, and it spawned a sequel, which is also pretty good. I honestly don't want to say too much about it now, because at some point I want to make a video comparing it to a story with a remarkably similar premise called The Silence. So stay tuned for that whenever I get to it. In fact, this is a good opportunity to remind you to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you don't miss that or any of my other videos. Lord knows I have a lot of good ones coming. Do be sure to share with a friend as well so we can keep growing our little weirdo community here. As for A Quiet Place, I'm going to reluctantly place it in the top category. It's right at that threshold between the good and the great, but I guess I'm feeling in a bit of a generous mood. Next we have Before the Fire. This is another pandemic movie. We do seem to have been seeing a disproportionate number of those these last few years. I can't even begin to fathom why. In this case, the movie came out in 2020, so I don't know whether it was inspired by recent events or if it's just a coincidence. Either way, it's actually not quite what I expected, because the pandemic is essentially backstory and takes place off-screen. The real action of the story takes place in a rural area largely untouched by the worldwide horrors, and centers on more human horrors related to interpersonal conflicts between the characters. That makes it less of a traditional horror story for sure. Indeed, one might argue that it's more of a drama than a real horror movie, but there's still plenty of horror and plenty of tension. It's just a subtler and more quiet kind of tension. On a whim, I read some reviews around the internet to see what other people thought of the movie, and I noticed a lot of them were complaining that it's more of a drama than a horror movie, that it's too slow, and so forth. They're wrong. I'll admit the movie isn't what I was expecting, but that doesn't make it bad. I actually think it's a lot better, objectively speaking, than a lot of the horror movies we all love. Because as much as I love some gratuitous violence, and I do, I'm honestly much more impressed by a well-acted and well-written character study, and that's a lot more like what this movie is. I'm honestly a bit uncertain whether to put this one in the middle or upper category. It's right at that threshold. I don't think it's a new favorite or anything, so I'm reluctant to give it the higher rating, but I'm actually going to do so in part to sort of counterbalance some of the undeserved negative reviews it's received. Next we have Annabelle Comes Home. I've talked about the Conjuring movies before. Annabelle Comes Home is the third in the Annabelle subseries and the seventh, I think, in the overall Conjuring series. And of course, it also centers on the self-professed demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren and their ongoing battle with the evil doll Annabelle. And honestly, it fits right in with the rest of the series. Since I've talked about the series before, I don't want to belabor the point here, except to say that I like the movie as long as one can separate it from the supposedly true story on which it's based. I keep saying I'll make a video about the Warrens and the Conjuring movies in detail, and I still plan on doing that. I just haven't gotten there yet, but one of these days I will. For now, Annabelle Comes Home goes into the middle group. Then we have It, Volume 1. Obviously, this is the recent remake of the adaptation of Stephen King's novel. It's a great novel, and I loved the Tim Curry miniseries from 1990. I also tend not to like remakes and reboots very much, so it had a lot of heavy lifting to do. Overall, I think it was successful. Skarsgård's performance as Pennywise is exemplary, as are most of the performances, and the production value is clearly higher than its predecessor, though a little bit of excessive CGI hurts it a smidge. I don't think the new Pennywise is nearly as good as Tim Curry's, despite the strength of the actor handling the role, and it comes down to the design of the character. Tim Curry's Pennywise looked like a friendly clown right up until he didn't, and therein lies the terror. He was scary because he perverted the friendly and the innocent, and he could look trustworthy until it was too late. The new Pennywise is absolutely scarier all the way through, but paradoxically that makes him less scary because you can see him coming. You'd never mistake him for a friendly clown. And of course, the film is divided into 2 volumes, of which this is the first, so you need to watch both to get the whole story. It's an interesting way of getting all the information across without having to cut it down to length, but I'm divided on whether I think that's a better idea than running it as a miniseries. Of course, only Volume 1 came in the HorrorPack, but my thoughts apply equally to both because I really think of them together as one long movie. I'm actually going to go ahead and put it into the top category, but with the caveat that it still ranks below the Tim Curry one. And then we have another HorrorPack exclusive called It Hatched. This is a bit of a strange one. It follows a couple who move to a remote house in Iceland to open a guest house. And of course, things don't go right. There's a weird hole in the basement, strains on their relationship, and a lot of weirdness that ultimately leads to the wife laying an egg. Yeah, it's a trippy sort of movie. On the plus side, it's got style to spare and some really great visuals to complement the bizarre storyline. But on the negative side, I don't think its attempts at horror comedy ended up hitting my funny bone quite as much as I would have liked. Nevertheless, though it's not a perfect movie, I'm glad to have seen it, and I'd recommend it for anyone who can find a copy. It's another one for the middle group. Moving right along to December 2022, I got some great stocking stuffers in my monthly boxes of horror movies, beginning with Deep Blue Sea 3. Honestly, it's another shark movie. Not just a shark movie, but a Deep Blue Sea movie, so it's all pretty familiar stuff, and you know exactly what you're in for with this film. And for better and for worse, it pretty much gives us exactly what we expect. Is it good? Well, objectively speaking, no. But is it fun to watch? It is indeed. I could have gone for more shark-related violence in a movie like this, and a bit less conflict between the human characters. That's the opposite of what I'd usually say, but this is another sharksploitation movie, so my expectations are a bit different. Anyway, it's certainly worth a watch if you like shark movies. It's better than most, though it won't ever hold up to the first Deep Blue Sea, and certainly not to classics like Jaws. But it's worth watching and belongs to the middle set. Next is Eaten Alive. And it's hard to know what to say about this movie. I mean, it's about a crazy innkeeper and his rather hungry pet crocodile, so we kind of know what we're in for. That it's a Tobe Hooper movie confirms it. It's as crazy and violent as we'd expect, both for better and for worse, because at the end of the day, it's not a great movie. Not bad, don't get me wrong, but not great. Taken purely on its own merit as a movie, it would go right into the middle group and wouldn't be all that memorable. But here's the thing. It's not just a B movie. It's a B horror movie with some history behind it. The cast and crew are something of a who's who of horror, and this edition is packed with special features that make it a real treat for horror fans. Even the film itself gives us the opportunity to see a largely forgotten, relatively early effort from one of the genre's masters. So, as a movie, I'd put it in the middle, but as a piece of horror history, I have to bump it to the top. Next is Black Pumpkin. This is a Halloween-themed slasher movie. We've got a group of kids squaring off against a killer called Bloody Bobby. You know, that's really all you need to know about this one. It's not a great film, it's not a terrible film. It's just exactly what it needs to be, no more and no less. It's not going to be something you reach for all the time, but when you're preparing your October marathon of Halloween-themed horror movies, it'll fit right in. This one, for that reason, goes to the middle group. Next is Scared Silly. This is a collection of 13 horror comedy movies. These collections are familiar. They take movies that are either in the public domain or at least cheap to get the rights to repackage, and they throw a bunch of them together. As such, there are always a few stinkers and usually a few standout classics. They ultimately make for a great way to see some older movies. This is no exception. It has the original Little Shop of Horrors, for instance, which is a mainstay on these kinds of collections, and is well worth a watch if you haven't seen it. I was also pleased to see such a so-called classic as Manos, The Hands of Fate, which is famous for being the worst movie ever made, though in reality, it's nothing even close to the sort. And if you haven't seen my video on the worst horror movies ever, you should check that out as well. I'll try to remember to drop a link down in the What's It. I was also surprised to find more relatively recent movies like My Mom's a Werewolf on this collection. Ultimately, it's a good mix of good and bad, and it's a great way to see some funny movies from decades past. Though if you're a collector of these kinds of packages, be prepared to see a lot of overlap between what's on this one and a bunch of other ones. It belongs to the good category. Next is The Lodge. In this movie, a family go to spend the holidays at a remote cabin. Present are a father and his 2 children, still recovering from their mother's death, as well as the new woman the father intends to marry. The children and the new wife-to-be don't get along particularly well, and a lot of the movie centers on the conflict between these characters as items start to go missing, and then things become increasingly bizarre and increasingly tense. It's very much a slow burn of a film. It's fairly quiet and unadorned by a lot of special effects or even music. It's just these characters and the horror in which they find themselves, and it's great for that. Some people may not like it because it is a slow burn, which it absolutely is, and some people may take issue with the ending, which I can understand, but I'm here to tell you that it's really good, and I think you're going to like it. This is one for the top category. Next, we have Dr. Sleep. Well, this is an interesting one. I think most of you probably know it's the sequel to The Shining, based on Stephen King's own sequel to The Shining. But that's an interesting thing, because the movie and book versions of The Shining are rather different. King's novel, Dr. Sleep, is a direct sequel to his original novel, so I was curious to see whether this film would be a sequel to the book, like King's novel was, or a sequel to the movie. And honestly, they surprised me a bit, because it manages to be a bit of both. It has a lot of direct references to Stanley Kubrick's film, so it's clearly a sequel to the movie. But at the same time, it largely follows the same setup as King's own sequel, so it could stand as a sort of sequel to either the book or to the movie, with just a couple minor changes to account for the differences between those various versions of The Shining. And by the way, if you're interested in more detail about the differences between the book, movie, miniseries, and opera versions of The Shining, I've discussed that matter at length elsewhere on this channel, so y'all should check that out after you're done watching this one as well. And of course, while we're on the subject of my other videos, do be sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you don't miss anything else. While you're at it, please do like this video, share it with a friend, and leave me a comment. All of those things will help my channel to shine on. Anyway, I hadn't read Dr. Sleep by the time this came in the HorrorPack, so I quickly read the book before watching the movie, as I tend to do. I liked the book overall. It ain't The Shining, but how could it be? It's still a pretty good read, and it was fun to see some old favorite characters once again. The movie starts with largely the same setup, though obviously severely condensed to make it fit into a couple of hours. Say what you will about Stephen King, but the man is a bit long-winded, so obviously there's more detail in the book. Where I was a bit surprised was that the film significantly diverges from the book toward the end, and actually ends up being a lot darker than the book version. I suppose I shouldn't have expected anything less with Mike Flanagan at the helm, but it surprised me anyway. In a good way. One thing about Stephen King is that his endings don't always work quite as well as they ought to, and while I wasn't exactly disappointed in the ending of Dr. Sleep the book, I do think the movie might have ultimately been more effective in the final act. But at the same time, the book presents a depth of characterization for all of the characters that the movie just can't. So I like them both for very different reasons. At the end of the day, though, while neither the book nor the movie will ever be anywhere as good as either the book or movie versions of The Shining, they're both quite good. And as for this movie, I'm happy to welcome it to the elusive top category. Next is a double feature of Gremlins and Gremlins 2. I don't know if I even need to say anything about this. I assume if you've found your way to my channel, you're probably already a Gremlins fan. It's a true classic for very good reason, and if you haven't seen it yet, you need to go and get yourself a copy. Of course, Gremlins 2 isn't as good as the first one, but it's still a lot of fun. And this double feature is exactly what you'd need if you didn't already have copies of both movies. It's going straight into the top category, not even a question about it. And then we have the HorrorPack exclusive 13 Slays Till Christmas, or Till Xmas, depending on how you choose to pronounce the title. This is an anthology film of holiday-themed horror shorts complete with a wraparound story involving a group of men in a dive bar passing the time by telling scary stories. It's clear from the start that this is a low-budget production, but what it occasionally lacks in production value, it more than makes up for with a lot of heart. Beginning with the premise that we can and should resurrect the tradition of telling scary stories on Christmas, the film treats us to a great collection of short films, as well as a wraparound story, perfect for the holiday season. I will be the first to admit that not all of the short films are winners. There are a couple standout greats, a couple that miss the mark, and most just do exactly what they set out to do. It's not the kind of movie that's likely to become a real favorite, but it's clear that it's made with a lot of respect for the genre, and it makes for a great addition to anyone's holiday horror movie list. It clearly belongs to the good category. As we move along, if you know anything, you know it's best to start the new year with some horror movies. HorrorPack understands this, and they sent me the following films with which to start my own new year in January of 2023. First up is Annihilation. This movie is based on the novel of the same title by Jeff Vandermeer, and if you like weird, this might be a good one for you. The premise is that a group of explorers are going to breach a sort of portal that's shown up and begun to expand. When they go through, they find themselves in a sort of parallel world or an alternate reality, and as sci-fi horror goes, it's a pretty good one. I don't think it's quite as clever as it thinks it is, but that doesn't mean it doesn't still have a solid premise, some creepy scenes, and a bit of good action. The astute viewer might detect some Lovecraftian notes lingering beneath the surface, which I always like. I've seen it a few times now, and I still like it. It's an easy candidate for the good category. Next up is The Midwife. This one's about a couple struggling to psychologically recover from a miscarriage. There's also a mysterious midwife who's injected herself into the situation. The story develops largely from there, but it takes its sweet time in doing so. Now, I like a good slow burn. The problem here is that slow burn only works when I'm invested in the characters. In this case, the living situation between the various characters it never quite makes sense to me. It all culminates in a twist ending that I admittedly didn't see coming, but that's mostly because there's not a real logical progression of ideas leading to it. I'd love to see a good scary movie about an evil midwife, but this one just wasn't quite it, and unfortunately goes into my lower category. Next is Gretel and Hansel. We all know the story. Hansel and Gretel are, of course, those two youths who are wandering in the woods, and they come across a house and refuge, we might say, that seems too good to be true. Against better judgment, they fall into the snare of a witch who intends to eat them. It's a classic story, collected by the Brothers Grimm, and I think everyone knows it well. This movie version starts with the same basic setup, but tries to expand upon the characters and the mythology to turn the classic fairy tale into a full-fledged horror movie. It's partially successful. Some have complained that it takes its sweet time to go anywhere, which is certainly true. It's among the very slowest of slow burns, in fact, but I actually think that worked to its advantage, building dark and creepy visuals as we experience the character's strange predicament. However, it just doesn't quite have the payoff it needs. We already know the ending of the fairy tale, and though the movie expands upon it quite a bit, with various additions achieving various degrees of success, it still ultimately treats us to exactly what we were expecting. No less, but certainly also no more. It therefore belongs to the middle group. Next is American Horror Stories. Here's another of those collections of classic horror movies. Often, when one is advertised as a collection of classics, it's really just a collection of old movies. Maybe even some in the public domain that a distributor could package together on the cheap. Not necessarily always really classic films. There's some truth to that even here, but it actually has some true classics of the genre included, such as House on Haunted Hill, Little Shop of Horrors, and Silent Night, Bloody Night. Admittedly, not all of these are great, but a few of them are truly excellent. Of course, the downside is there's a fair amount of overlap between the films included in these things. For example, The Little Shop of Horrors isn't just on this one, but was also on a collection I got in an earlier month. But if you don't mind a bit of overlap, this is a good way to get a variety of movies, some of them excellent, all in one place. I'm averaging all the films together and putting it in the middle. Next up is Distorted. This movie follows Christina Ricci and a somewhat underutilized John Cusack as they attempt to solve a sort of cyber conspiracy mystery surrounding unusual events at Ricci's new apartment. And it has a lot going for it. I like conspiracy stories, whether cyber or otherwise. I like that it takes one's home, meant to be a place of safety and refuge, and turns it into something sinister. And of course, it's got an amazing cast. There's really nothing to complain about here. The only downside is that the conspiracy itself, while certainly interesting and sinister enough to fill a movie, isn't necessarily all that memorable. I'll be putting this one in the middle as well. And then there's Reunion. This is the story of a pregnant woman who returns to her childhood home and reunites with her estranged family. Along the way, some secrets come to light, and it plays with a lot of ideas about family and childhood guilt. And I really should have loved it. It's well acted, and the themes are interesting. It's a slow burn for sure, but it's the kind of slow burn I normally like. I think the biggest problem here is that the payoff just doesn't pay off well enough to justify everything that's come before. In the end, though I appreciate a film not answering all of my questions, I was left with maybe too many questions to be personally satisfied. I'm going to put it in the middle group because I think it has all the elements of greatness even though it doesn't ever quite put them together. Next is Ill, Final Contagium. This is an anthology film that tells 3 stories of a deadly pathogen transmitted by contaminated money. I really love that idea. Unfortunately, none of the films manage to be nearly as interesting as the idea that unifies them. And that idea is really just the bare bones premise and doesn't have much to do with the action in any of the stories. Most of the characters in the stories are completely loathsome in one way or another, and though I can appreciate some gore, I found I never really cared enough about the victims to transform gore into horror. The only story I found worthwhile at all in the film was the one about a father trying to save his son, because that's at least a character I can get behind, but even it never really pulled me in, and it felt like too little too late. Indeed, the only reason I even finished watching it was because I'll never review something without watching the whole thing. This one, unfortunately, belongs to the bottom group. Then we have Worst Laid Plans, the HorrorPack exclusive and another anthology film, but it's much better than the last one. In this case, the unifying theme is travel, as all the stories take place during vacations. I only learned after watching the credits that the stories were adapted from an anthology put out by Grindhouse Press, which probably explains why the writing seems so much better here. We've got a story about a family who encounters some thing in a cave, a woman who receives a note containing a cryptic distress call, and a stalker. There's no wraparound story, so each one stands on its own. And while I could easily rank order my preferences, I honestly think the whole thing is worth watching. Not quite good enough for the top category perhaps, but an easy choice for the middle group, and a refreshing recovery after its predecessor. Finally, we come to February of 2023. It may be the shortest month of the year, though frankly this year every month so far seems to have been only 3 days long, but I digress. Anyway, though February is a short month, it still features a full helping of new horror movies. First up is Freshwater. This is an interesting one. From the cover, it looks like a sort of monster movie or creature feature about alligators or crocodiles. And that's essentially what it is, though it doesn't make a whole lot of the creature effects I was expecting, and it ends up feeling a bit more like a slasher movie whose villain just happens to be an alligator. At the end of the day, the script is mediocre but passable, and it feels like everyone did their best, but the visuals just weren't quite there in a movie that really needs the visuals to be effective. It's certainly not bad enough for the bottom category, nor great enough or memorable enough for the top category, so it goes right into the middle group. And then we have The Nun. I've talked about the Conjuring franchise a lot, including earlier in this video, so there's not a whole lot more that needs to be said. The Nun is part of that franchise, and my thoughts about the whole thing apply here as much as they do to the other films. One thing I liked a lot about The Nun, more than the rest of the franchise, is that it's entirely a work of fiction and removed from the allegedly true stories involving the Warrens. They do show up toward the end of the movie to tie it in with the rest of the franchise, but it's largely an independent story and serves as a prequel to the Conjuring movies, which I like. I also think it's easily one of the best in the series in terms of creepy visuals. I love horror movies surrounding churches and religious imagery, and The Nun is chock full of it, making it, I think, not only one of the creepiest in the series, but also one of the more visually interesting horror movies of recent years. Story-wise, it's arguably not quite as good as some of the others in the franchise, but its virtues more than make up for its faults. Along with the rest of the franchise, it goes into the middle category, but with the note that it belongs at the high end of that category. That brings us next to Truth or Dare. If I told you that Blumhouse made a movie called Truth or Dare, you would immediately know pretty much everything about this movie, even if you never saw it, never watched the trailer, or never even heard of it before. It's about a game of Truth or Dare in which some evil force gets involved, forcing the players to complete increasingly dangerous tasks or face deadly consequences. If you think that sounds like a stupid movie, you're not entirely wrong. If you think it also sounds like a fun movie, you're right there too. It is a pretty stupid, but generally fun, generic horror movie that ticks all the necessary boxes, never really transcending the expected. Almost by definition, that's middle group territory. Next is Evil Everywhere. This is the one about an evil force that once killed students in alphabetical order and resurfaced in the present day to kill again. Much to my disappointment, it was never made clear whether they were killed in order by given name or family name, unless I just happened to miss the part of the movie that explained it, but that's hardly grounds on which to judge a movie. Honestly, it's a difficult one to judge though. Objectively, it's not great. There are continuity errors all over the place, and it's clearly a micro-budget feature, so the production value isn't really on par with what we expect, even from relatively amateur, low-budget movies these days. On the other hand, it does have a lot of heart, and could be a really fun watch if you're in the right kind of mood. Ultimately, I feel like this one has a very niche audience. If you're the kind of person who used to enjoy watching all those shot-on-video horror movies back in the day, this is going to be right up your alley. If you're looking for a more polished and professional product, it's not going to be for you. For me, I can appreciate either kind of movie depending on my mood, so this one belongs in the middle category with the potential to either ascend or descend depending on how serious I'm feeling on the one hand versus how many drinks I've had on the other hand. Next up is The Forever Purge. I think most of us know The Purge by now. The series is about an imagined future in which all crime, including murder, is legal for one night out of the year. The idea is that if people can purge their violent tendencies in one night, they won't do so the rest of the year. It's a fascinating idea, and the first movie in the series was a brilliant home invasion story that explored that idea. However, as the series has gone on, it's become more overtly political, lost its subtlety, and lost a lot of the horror of the original. The premise of this latest movie is that people have decided to expand the purge beyond its allotted night and begun simply to riot whenever they please. I do think that's a worthy idea for a purge movie because it probably is the inevitable outcome of a policy like the purge. Catharsis doesn't really work. It seems to work for a while often, but frequently ends up reinforcing the negative behavior, so it's entirely plausible that this would be the outcome. However, it's just not a very good movie anymore. They've taken what was once a great horror franchise and turned it into an action franchise that barely has any tension, much less actual terror. Worse, they've centralized their political plot lines to the point that no one cares to even grapple with psychopolitical issues raised by the first movie. Instead, people are clearly meant to see the film as an allegory for current events, but the presentation of those events is so skewed and so mindless as to be essentially unwatchable. Even within the context of a fictional world in which the purge is a reality, the actions taken both by individuals and by nations in this film are asinine and simply unbelievable. It does have a few good action scenes, but if all you want is action, you'd be better served by something like the new John Wick movie, where the choreography is better and the plot doesn't insult your intelligence. It's a shame because the first Purge movie would have gone into the top category, but this one easily belongs to the bottom. Next up is The Fanatic. This is the story about an obsessed fan trying to get an autograph from a movie star. But when he's turned away, he becomes more desperate and starts doing the kinds of things he oughtn't. It's really interesting to see that kind of exploration of celebrity culture and how it can lead to all kinds of nonsense. And as much as there's some irony that Hollywood people are talking about the dark side of the celebrity culture they largely created, it's still an interesting idea. It's not really a true horror movie. There are some horror elements, but I'd honestly call it more of a thriller. What I really like, though, is that the roles get somewhat reversed. We end up finding the guy doing the home invasion to be often a more sympathetic character than the victim. And that subversion of expectations is quite good, and of course having John Travolta in the lead as the obsessed fan adds a lot to the movie. I can't quite bring myself to put it in the best group, but it's still quite good, and I think a lot of people may have missed this one, so you might want to check it out. It belongs to the good category. Next is Open 24 Hours. This one's about a girl who was recently released from prison after she set her serial killer boyfriend on fire. She's taken a job working the night shift at a 24-hour convenience store. When I opened this up in the package, my first thought was, that's not a great idea. Even without her history, I've seen some weird critters come through the gas station in the middle of the night, which is usually when I'm out and about. So I can't imagine someone dealing with PTSD and hallucinations doing well in that setting, even if the quiet of the night shift is certainly appealing. Well, things go about as well as expected. She encounters some of the same kind of weirdos I've been talking about, and then it starts to seem like her ex has escaped from prison and come after her. It's not clear immediately whether she's mentally unwell or whether there's really something going on, but it builds a lot of tension, and I have to credit the lead actress for an excellent performance. I'm honestly going back and forth on whether I think this belongs to the good or great category, because it's right on that precipice between the two. But I'm feeling in a generous mood, so I'm going to go ahead and put it on the top. Next, and finally, we have Bad Dreams, the Best of Nightmares Film Festival 2022. This is our last offering for this half a year. And this is the second of these collections from Nightmares Film Festival that I've received in the HorrorPacks, and as the HorrorPack exclusives, and I was thrilled to get it. The first one from the previous year was a truly phenomenal collection of short films and easily belonged in that top category. I'm at least pretty sure that's where I put it when I reviewed them, and if I didn't, I made a mistake. So I was all kinds of excited about getting this one. Following the format of the first, it's another collection of short films, and because it's a collection, of course, some of them are going to be better than others. At the end of the day, I don't think this set was quite as transcendently good as the first set, but that doesn't mean they're not good. They are good. While I put the first one in the top category, this one doesn't quite get there, but still easily belongs at the top end of the good category. And so there we have it. Let's go ahead and count up all of the totals and see how HorrorPack did over these last 6 months. I'll start over here. Let's see, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Alright, the totals are in, and it looks like we have only 5 for the low category during these last 6 months, which is not bad at all. The lion's share, of course, belongs to the middle category with no fewer than 32 entries. And finally, the top category also made an impressive showing with a very impressive and lucky 13 movies. Adding those to the totals from my previous couple years of review, that brings the grand totals for the entire duration of my HorrorPack subscription to 42 in the lower group, which is one of my favorite numbers, and any Hitchhiker's Guide fans out there will know what I'm talking about. In the middle group, we have a whopping 144 movies, which is great. And finally, we have a very impressive 70 movies in the top group, which is to say, that's just a little over 16% in the bottom, a little over 56% in the middle, and just over 27% on the top. No, those don't quite add up to 100% because of rounding errors, but close enough is close enough. Alas, that brings us to the end of another video. I'm always sad to end our time together, though I suspect this video has been long enough that y'all are ready to take your leave, so I won't belabor the point any longer, except to say, as always, take care and stay scared.